How's it going, everyone? This is International Master Daniel Rensch. This is Chess.com. And this is the day we bring it all together. You've made it this far. We are now in the bottom of the ninth. The bases are loaded. The whole enchilada, the big cheese, and that's enough silly references. The bottom line is that you've made it this far. You've watched the first 3 videos in the Everything You Need to Know video series. You now understand the critical principles of all 3 stages of the game. And here, we'd like to show you 2 games that are considered a couple of the greatest in history by a couple of the greatest players in chess history. And hopefully what you'll see is that all of the principles and things you've learned can be put into action. They can be brought together to play a complete and sometimes brilliant chess game. These games have been seen before, but what we are going to try to highlight is that the principles and things we've talked about were a part of these games. And maybe it will give you a new light and a new perspective on what happened and what took place in these chess games. The first one is the game between Paul Morphy and the Duke of Brunswick, as well as Count Izuard, I believe is how you pronounce his name, or Izuard. This is the opera game. It took place in Paris, France, in an opera theater house. And it's a famous chess game, one because Paul Morphy was known as one of the most principled and best attacking chess players of all time. He was playing royalty, and it was a miniature in the sense of White's approach to the game being just about perfect. And when he didn't run up against the toughest defense, it was an ugly game. And it was a very quick game and a beautiful one from the perspective of applying the principles and things that we've learned. Before we continue, remind you that you can back up and watch the other videos in this series if you haven't already. They are completely free to all members here on Chess.com. And so if there are principles or things that I reference in this video that you're not completely confident with, even if you have watched those videos, I would strongly suggest that you back up, take a gander, and then come back and watch how we bring it all together in this video here. Paul Morphy starts with e4, considered one of the most natural moves to start out. Obviously, both e4 and d4 on move 1 being the most common approaches. You put a pawn in the center, you fight for the center, and as we discussed in principle number 4, bringing your pieces out toward the center is where they want to be, not just developed randomly. And so he continues that by bringing the knight out to attack the pawn on e5, and black defends the pawn. Already this is known as the Philidor Defense, which was more popular before the modern theories of chess took over, I would say in the 20th century, and they recognized that this is probably a slightly passive approach for black when compared to move 2 knight to c6. But nonetheless, we saw d6, and what's important is not that black's play was perfect in this game, that the 2 players discussed the moves perfectly, but more so that Morphy executed in a high-level manner that everybody can do in their own games if they think about the principles that we've talked about here. He immediately challenges the center because with the last move d6, one of the reasons why the Philidor is considered slightly passive is what it does to black's potential space and fighting power in the center. Blocking the bishop, white has no reason not to be aggressive and challenge the center because of what black has done. And here black makes the first mistake. A move such as knight to c6, again, to defend the pawn would have been better. The move bishop g4 was played as it pins the knight on f3. However, after d takes e5, what black quickly realized is that simply capturing back the pawn would allow a queen trade on d8, followed by the immediate win of the e5 pawn. So, black made the right decision rather than just to lose the pawn, but to capture f3, eliminate the knight first, and then capture back. The problem is that the immediate loss of the bishop pair, meaning the bishop on c8 for the knight on f3, gives white an easy time developing his own light square bishop. Now what we notice is not only is white developing, therefore following the principles of development, but also doing so with a purpose and tempo. This isn't just a trick going for the form of checkmate, but rather white is developing the pieces with tempo and attacking f7 with tempo. It makes a big difference. Immediately we see that though white has the possibility here to castle short, which would not have been a bad move, white recognizes that his opponent, having given up the bishop pair so early and neglecting the development of the king side, which usually is preferred here so that black can castle quickly, in doing so, he opened up the possibility for a fork tactic, White has the ability to make a move that is a double attack, and that move is queen to b3, attacking both the f7 pawn as well as the undefended b7 pawn. Now, perhaps what's most amazing about this move here is not just that it's a fork, but how he followed up the next move. After black chose to play queen e7, which already shows that he's in dire straits because he's willing to block this bishop, which therefore blocks the rook, which therefore prevents castling. Black is willing to make such a critical move because he's hoping that white will simply be settled on the pawn advantage and allow the queens to be traded. Morphy, though, who was a very principled player and understood these features perhaps in such a way that was very ahead of his time. That being the features I just highlighted, that black's lack of development is perhaps the bigger weakness in this position than the b7 pawn is. Perhaps the bigger problem for black is the lack of development and therefore potentially weak king. And in doing so, white played knight to c3, exclamaviach, my favorite word for exclam. A great move that not only develops a piece but prevents black from simply escaping his doom of a king in the center and trading queens. He prevents the trade of queens on b4 that would have taken place once again after queen takes b7 check. So, after playing knight to c3, black now realizes that without the ability to trade queens, allowing this pawn to be captured followed by the loss of a rook is simply too much to bear, and c6 is played as a natural move. Not only does c6 guard the b7 pawn because it opens up the queen, but it also guards a couple of critical squares in the center, so a good move by black. White now plays bishop to g5. Notice that that's a pin, so that's the second tactic from our second Everything You Need to Know video that we've seen today. The first one being a fork. Now we're seeing a pin in action. And notice that it's interesting that these tactical patterns are taking place while white is developing. This is not something, chess is not a game that can be broken down into black and white in the sense that you try to think about everything in terms of generalities and principles. You should think about all three of the videos that you watched on the different stages of the game as one big video. As we said, it's the one chess lesson you need in your life. And in this situation where we bring it all together in the climax video, you see that you're developing, but you're doing it with purpose, and that purpose, which was mentioned in the first video, can be things like forks and pins. So it all happens at a very early stage, and Morphy understood that developing his pieces aggressively to these sort of tactical squares was a great idea and a great way to put his opponent under pressure. Now, black probably should have just focused on completing development. However, he didn't want to, based on the loss of the b7 pawn. And moving the queen one more time in order to try to open up the bishop to get castled also seemed very slow. Instead of emphasizing those points, black thought he had an opportunity to put back white's pieces, to kick them back a little bit, so that then he could refocus his efforts on developing. And the two players discussed playing b5. The idea was simply to force this bishop to retreat so that now there would be less pressure on the f7 pawn, therefore allowing the queen to move, which would therefore allow the bishop to move. You see that black needed all these things to come together in order to make up for the previous mistakes. The queen cannot just move right away because of pressure on the f7 pawn, for example. But without the queen moving, the bishop on f8 will not have the ability to move, and therefore the king will never get castled. So we see that black's problems sort of mounted up, whereas white's were natural and developing his pieces to the right tactical squares and with tempo and with purpose. He's put black in this very rough situation. So black played b5 to try to get his way, to kick white's bishop back and to try to free up his pieces to get his development complete. And now we see the climax. White captured the b5 pawn, sensing the opportunity to open the position. The key to white's ability to sense that opportunity was that normally the most accurate way to punish your opponent's lack of development, and therefore their neglect of the king's safety, is to open the center. So though his opponents may have been surprised by this shot, as we said, Morphy's principles led the way, and he sensed the opportunity for his pieces to take control in terms of their activity and for the tactics to work out well for white. After the move knight b to d7, white continues to develop with tempo, bringing more pressure to the critical squares, and you'll notice completing the principles of the opening as we talked about, connecting the rooks, bringing it together. Now black is in a tough situation where all of white's activity is simply overwhelming. He played the move rook to d8, which makes perfect sense, perhaps the only really natural move to try to defend against white's pressure. However, it simply was not enough. It was now time to put it away, and as in all games, you can develop all the principles you want and put all the pressure on your opponent based on these general, fundamental, and critical ideas you've learned, but at some point you simply have to calculate and look for a chance to deliver the knockout blow. And that's exactly what Morphy does here, starting with the brilliant move, rook takes d7. Winning the material back and threatening a devastating discovered check. You see another one of our tactics. If this rook moves anywhere, let alone the fact that it's threatening the queen, if this rook moves anywhere, it would be opening up the bishop for check. Black simply had to capture back, and after the other rook joins the fight, we highlight one more time just how weak Black's position is due to the lack of development. He tries to get out of it by moving the queen off so that the bishop can finally develop. Unfortunately, though, it was not enough to get out of the forced checkmate that was about to be had. Bishop takes d7. The knight recaptures back so as not to lose the queen on e6. And after the brilliant double exclamavich, queen to b8 check, Black has no other move but to capture on b8 with the knight, and White delivers the fatal blow, rook to d8 checkmate. Though the final position doesn't show many of the pieces that were developed by White, we saw that the development of the pieces is what led to this brilliant combination. And Black's extra material was not relevant, as the fact that his king is now checkmated before move 20. We hope you enjoyed this game, and now let's move on to our second example, designed to help highlight and show for you the principles of the endgame in practice. Though there are many incredible champions in the history of our game who've executed great endgame technique at critical moments throughout their career, we chose a game played by often considered one of the greatest endgame players of all time, that being the third world champion, Jose Raul Capablanca, here playing the white pieces against Rogozin, who was another very strong chess player during that era. What we plan to highlight for you in this game are the two critical principles that we taught in yesterday's video here on Chess.com, that being king activity and the recognition and then execution of a passed pawn. Though the passed pawn on a3 is an obvious one, it is rather blockaded, here with Black's pieces strategically placed very well to hold back the advancement of the queenside pawns. What we'd like you to watch closely over the next few minutes is how Capablanca activates his king, keeps his pieces centralized, and though eventually does not push the a-pawn particularly to victory, the constant threat of advancing the a-pawn allows him to target other weaknesses in Black's camp, eventually creating a passed pawn on the other side of the board. White starts with the move f4, a key moment for us to start this video, showing that the recognition that his king is not active and in the game yet was critical for Capablanca, and that he would no longer wait to bring the leader into the fight. Black tries to do the same thing, and when attacks the pawn, White simply defends. And as both sides develop a few more moves, Black realizes he must keep his king back in order to deal with the threats of discovered check by his opponent. White uses the extra time to activate his own king, keeps the pieces centralized, and improves them over the next few moves, starting with the king, eventually bringing the knight back to the critical square. Noted should be that White is not worried about this capture due to the discovered check, and therefore win of the rook. The game continues with White eventually making the critical move here with king to c4, the threat being very simply to come to b4 and begin advancing the a-pawn. Because of this, Black's time had run out. It was no longer an option to simply sit on the position, as White had clearly broken down the blockade that this bishop and rook once held over the light squares. That blockade no longer existing after the moves b5 and c4 and king to c4 meant that Black had to start lashing out. He played bishop e6 check and c5 check, a move that Black wouldn't normally want to play, as after simply taking en passant, White now has the lone outside a-pawn with no other challengers on the queen side, and this bishop having misplaced itself on the other side of the board. White now, rather than simply pushing the a-pawn, which would have also won, chose to keep the constant threats against Black's now newly created weaknesses, because Black didn't want to sit on the position and instead chose to advance the pawns. White begins creating threats, and over the next few moves you'll see that White targets the king side along with keeping the constant threat of pushing this pawn as an option. White brings the rook over to the king side, preparing to win more material. And after a few more moves, we see that black is completely stuck with the pieces split, in the sense that they must now deal with one outside passed pawn along with the passed pawn they've been dealing with for the last several moves. After rook c8, rook g7 check, and the eventual defending against white's possible loss of a piece with the move rook to c4, after Capablanca defended that threat, the game became very easy, and after h4, black simply resigned due to his inability to create any more counterplay with the rook and bishop, and in turn, without counterplay, black has no chance to stop both of white's outside passed pawns. Note that king activity and the execution of the extra pawns led to Capablanca's victory in this game. We hope you enjoyed the Everything You Need to Know video series. In watching these videos, please recognize that knowledge of the principles and the fundamentals can help you to execute more powerful moves. And when you see how great champions brought these principles together in their own games, hopefully you have the knowledge and you are now psyched up to apply all the things you've learned over the last few days in your own games. This has been International Master Daniel Rensch for Chess.com, and we will see you around.